Arizona Territory, 1883. In the remote scrubland near Eagle Creek, roughly 40 miles from the burgeoning settlement of Clifton, the silence was broken only by the rasp of cicadas and the dry, rhythmic huff of livestock exhaling in the heat. At the Six-By homestead, a generous term for two mud-daubed shacks and a corral carved out of the hostile geography, two women were alone. Their husbands had ridden out before dawn, rifles scabbarded, to check the herd in the high pastures where the Apaches had been raiding with increasing desperation. The women were left to the domesticity of survival, washing, mending, and watching the horizon. It was mid-morning when one of the women picked up a galvanized bucket and walked toward the spring. The spring was the lifeline of the ranch, a patch of verdant green and a sea of brown. Located about 100 yards from the main cabin, the second woman remained inside, her hands deep in bread dough, the windows propped open to catch the phantom breeze. The first indication that the world had tilted off its axis was the dog. It was a hardened ranch mongrel, a creature built of scar tissue and instinct, usually asleep in the shade of the porch. It woke suddenly, not with a bark, but with a low, vibrating whine. It scrambled to its feet, hackles rising like a ridge of stiff wire along its spine. It backed away from the open door, tail tucked so tight it nearly touched its stomach. The woman at the window wiped the flour from her hands and looked out. The sun was blinding, bleaching the color out of the chaparral. She saw the figure of her friend near the spring, bending down to the water. Then she heard the sound. It was not the stealthy snap of a twig that signals a predator. It was a thunderous, chaotic crashing, the sound of heavy brush being pulverized by something massive moving at speed. The ground vibrated, a tremor that rattled the tin cups on the shelf. The woman at the spring stood up, shading her eyes. She didn't scream immediately. She froze, her posture locking into the paralysis of a mind trying to process an image that defied biological taxonomy. From the dense mesquite, a nightmare erupted. It was red, a rusted, dried blood red, and it was colossal. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, a towering architecture of muscle and fur that blocked out the sun. But the true horror wasn't the beast itself. It was what rode upon it. Perched high on the creature's back was a shape that looked like a man, but wrong. It was loose, flailing, with a rictus grin, bouncing grotesquely with the animal's loping stride. The scream finally tore from the woman's throat, a jagged, high-pitched tear in the silence. It was cut short by a wet thud. The woman in the cabin slammed the heavy wooden door and threw the bolt. She dragged a heavy oak table against it, her breath coming in shallow, sobbing gasps. Outside, the world dissolved into violence. There was the sound of heavy, wet impacts, like a mallet striking raw meat, and the terrifying guttural bellows of the beast. It wasn't a roar. It was a groaning, bubbling sound, ancient and angry. And then, as quickly as the storm had broken, the silence returned. When the husbands rode back hours later, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the canyon walls in bruised purples and crimsons. They found the cabin door barricaded. They had to coax the terrifyingly silent survivor to open it. She could only point toward the spring, her eyes wide, staring at a reality that no longer made sense. They found the other wife pressed into the mud. She hadn't just been killed. She had been erased. Her body was trampled, broken in a way that suggested the casual indifference of immense power. The ground around her told a story that the men, experienced trackers who knew every print from a coyote to a mountain lion, could not read. The hoof prints were cloven like a cow's, but they were monstrous, nearly double the size of a draft horse's print, and snagged on the brush, fluttering in the hot wind, were tufts of coarse reddish hair. To understand the panic that followed, one must understand the psychology of the Arizona Territory in the 1880s. This was not a place for ghost stories. It was a place of brutal, distinct materialism. Death came from understandable vectors. a rattlesnake strike, an Apache arrow, a collapsing mine shaft, or the slow desiccation of thirst. The settlers were people of the tangible. They feared what they could see, shoot, and bury. The Eagle Creek killing violated the social contract. The body was transported to the nearest seat of authority for a coroner's inquest. In the rough-hewn offices of Solomonsville, the air smelled of stale tobacco smoke, dust, and the metallic tang of formaldehyde. The coroner, a man accustomed to bullet wounds and blunt force trauma, found himself staring at a corpse that defied forensic logic. The injuries were consistent with being trampled by a herd of cattle, yet the witnesses, the husband and the surviving woman, spoke of a single animal. The footprint casts, crude mud impressions dried in the sun, sat on the coroner's desk like artifacts from a different epoch. They measured considerably larger than any domestic beast known to the territory. Then there was the testimony of the survivor. She did not speak of a bear or a bull. She spoke of a red ghost. She spoke of a demon rider, a dark figure strapped to the back of the beast, urging it on. The coroner was a man of science, or at least as much science as the frontier allowed. He wanted to rule this a homicide. He wanted to blame the Apaches, or a drifter, or even the husband. But the physical evidence, the hair, the prints, the sheer crushing force required to inflict such damage, stayed his hand. The official verdict, recorded in the dusty ledgers of Graham County and reported with grim fascination by the Mojave County miner, was a terrifying admission of ignorance. Death in some manner unknown. This phrase was the spark. If the law could not name the killer, then the killer was beyond the law. The story metastasized. It traveled along the freight lines and the telegraph wires. It was whispered in the saloons of Kingman and the mining camps of Clifton. The red ghost was no longer an isolated incident. It was a presence. The status quo of the frontier had been disrupted. The belief that man had dominion over the wild through the application of gunpowder and grit was gone. The dark had teeth again. The weeks following the Eagle Creek tragedy saw the Arizona Territory descend into a period of high-alert paranoia. Every rustle in the chaparral became the ghost. Every shadow cast by the moon became the demon rider. But unlike most folklore, which dissipates under the harsh light of scrutiny, the red ghost provided fresh evidence. It was not a spirit that vanished into the ether. It was a physical entity that left a wake of destruction. In the gold-bearing hills of Chase's Creek, a group of prospectors had set up camp. These were hard men, calloused by pick handles and cynicism. They didn't believe in ghosts. They were asleep in their canvas wall tent, the heavy fabric acting as a flimsy shield against the night. The air was cool. The fire banked down to embers. The attack didn't begin with a sound. It began with pressure. One of the miners woke to the sensation of the world collapsing. The tent poles snapped with the sharp crack of pistol shots. The heavy canvas, weighed down by the center pole, came crashing down on the sleeping men. Panic ensued. Men thrashed in the dark, entangled in blankets and canvas, shouting for their weapons. Through the confusion, a sound cut through the chaos, the sound of heavy, pounding hooves. As the men clawed their way out from under the ruin of their camp, one prospector managed to scramble free in time to see the retreat. Illuminated by the dying embers of the fire and the starlight, he saw it. It was impossibly tall. Its silhouette jagged and wrong. It moved with a rolling, swaying gait that was nauseating to watch. And there, backlit by the stars, was the rider. The prospectors fired their Winchesters into the dark, the muzzle flashes blooming like orange flowers in the night. The shots echoed off the canyon walls. But there was no cry of pain, no thud of a falling body, just the receding thunder of hooves and a terrifying, high-pitched scream that sounded like a woman in agony, or a demon laughing. When dawn broke, the thicket of evidence grew denser. The camp was a wreck. Supplies were scattered, but crucially uneaten. A bear would have torn into the salt pork and flour. The red ghost had simply destroyed. It was an act of malice, not hunger. Once again, the red hairs were found. Once again, the massive prints. The territory's newspapers, particularly the Mojave County Miner, began to act as a clearinghouse for the hysteria. The editorial tone shifted from skeptical bemusement to genuine alarm. The thicket of the investigation was growing impassable with contradictory theories. Theory 1. The grizzly. The skeptics clung to this, a rogue grizzly bear, perhaps mange-ridden, explaining the red hair. But bears have paws, not hooves, and bears do not carry riders. Theory 2. The prank. Could it be a man? A bandit using an elaborate costume to scare prospectors off rich claims? This was the preferred theory of the lawmen. It offered a human target. But the physics didn't hold. No costume could replicate the crushing weight that pulverized the woman at Eagle Creek or snapped the tent poles at Chase's Creek. And no man could run with the speed attributed to the ghost. Theory 3. The supernatural. The local indigenous tribes had long spoken of skinwalkers and spirits. But the white settlers, largely Christian or fiercely atheist, began to craft their own mythology. They whispered that the rider was the devil himself, collecting souls. They said the beast was an escaped monstrosity from a traveling circus that had made a pact with hell. The investigation stalled. The ghost seemed to know the terrain better than the men who claimed to own it. It moved through the harshest, driest corridors of the desert, places where a horse would die of thirst in 2 days. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet observation of a credible witness. The moment the narrative shifted from a ghost story to a tragedy. Cyrus Hamblin was not a drunkard, nor was he a man given to flights of fancy. He was a rancher on the Salt River, a man whose reputation was as solid as the ironwood trees that dotted his land. He knew animals. He knew the difference between a shadow and a shape. He was riding the perimeter of his land, navigating the deep, treacherous ravines that cut through the landscape like scars. He paused to let his horse blow, scanning the opposite ridge, perhaps 300 yards away. There, moving through the catastrophic geology of the ravine, was the beast. Hamblin raised his field glasses. The magnification cut through the heat haze. He adjusted the focus, expecting to see a deformed bear or an elk. What he saw stopped his breath. It was a camel. It was immense. Far larger than the illustrations he had seen in Bibles or school books. It was covered in matted reddish fur. But it was the rider that drew Hamblin's horror. Through the glass, Hamblin could see that the rider was not guiding the animal. The rider was dead. It was a desiccated human corpse, sun-blackened and shriveled, lashed to the camel's hump with a complex web of rawhide straps. The corpse's head lolled sickeningly with every step the animal took. The arms dangled loose, the hands like dried claws knocking against the camel's flanks. Hamblin realized the devil was a victim, and the monster was a beast of burden, driven mad by the terror of the dead weight strapped to its spine. The red ghost was not hunting. It was running. It had been running for years. Hamblin's report changed the texture of the fear. It didn't reduce it. It curdled it into something more grotesque. The idea of a ghost was frightening, but abstract. The reality, a torture device wandering the desert, was visceral. The narrative shifted from survival to the hunt. Reports came in faster now. The identification of the animal as a camel unlocked a suppressed memory in the collective consciousness of the territory. The U.S. Army Camel Corps, the failed experiment of the 1850s, where Secretary of War Jefferson Davis had imported camels to traverse the arid Southwest. When the Civil War broke out, the project was abandoned. The camels were sold to circuses, to miners, or simply turned loose into the desert to fend for themselves. But this camel was different. This camel carried a burden. The escalation reached its peak a few months later near the Verde River. A group of prospectors, heavily armed and jittery, spotted the red ghost grazing on greasewood. This time, they didn't wait to be attacked. They opened fire. The volley of shots echoed across the flats. The camel screamed, that same high-pitched, terrifying sound, and bolted. It didn't fall. It seemed impervious to pain, fueled by adrenaline and madness. But as it crested a ridge and vanished, something detached from its back. The prospectors approached the site cautiously, weapons drawn. Lying in the dust amidst the crushed sagebrush was the evidence that would cement the legend. It was a human skull. It had not fallen cleanly. Strips of dried skin and sinew still clung to the bone. Clumps of hair remained on the scalp. It had been shaken loose by the violence of the camel's flight. The Mojave County miner reported the find with grim satisfaction. The devil rider was falling apart, piece by piece. The mystery of what the ghost was had been solved. But the question of who the rider was and who had strapped him there remained a dark void. Was it a soldier, tied on as a joke by drunk comrades in the 1850s, only for the camel to bolt? Was it a prospector caught by Apaches and bound to the beast as a torture method? Or was it, as the miner speculated, an ugly piece of humor by a murderer needing to dispose of a body, ensuring it was never found? The skull offered no answers. It only stared back at the prospectors, its jaw set in an eternal scream, a tangible piece of the nightmare that refused to die. The discovery of the skull changed the frequency of the fear in the Arizona territory. It did not dissipate the terror. It transmuted it. The red ghost was no longer a supernatural entity that could walk through walls or vanish into smoke. It was something arguably worse, a biological reality, driven mad by a cruelty so specific and elaborate that it implied a human intelligence behind it. The skull sat in the offices of the Mojave County miner, a macabre paperweight that drew crowds. Men would stare at the scraps of skin and the tufts of hair, trying to reverse engineer the crime. This was the era of the frontier, where death was usually transactional, a dispute over cards, cattle, or water. But this was performative. To lash a living man to a living beast required planning. It required ropes, knots, and time. It required a suppression of empathy that bordered on the psychopathic. The who became the obsession of the territory. Hypothesis A, the military accident. The U.S. Camel Corps had been disbanded years prior. The logic went that perhaps a soldier, drunk or disciplined, had been tied to a camel as a form of field punishment, or a hazing ritual gone wrong. The camel, spooked, had bolted into the desert, carrying its screaming burden into oblivion. It was a theory that indicted the incompetence of the army, a popular pastime in the West. Hypothesis B, the Apache torture. This was the racially charged reflex of the time. Settlers were quick to attribute any grotesque violence to the Apache, yet those who knew Apache warfare dismissed it. The Apache killed for resources, for territory, or for revenge. They did not create wandering monuments to suffering. Their violence was direct, not this slow, wandering theater of agony. Hypothesis C, the ugly humor. This was the darkest theory, the one the miner alluded to. That two prospectors, perhaps partners, had fallen out. That one, holding the gun, had forced the other onto the back of a feral camel caught near a waterhole. That he had tied the knots with the meticulous care of a sailor, ensuring they would not slip. That he had slapped the beast's flank and watched his partner ride off into a death that would take days, weeks, or months to arrive. It was this theory that kept the ranches locked at night. It meant there was a man walking among them, drinking at their bars, buying supplies at their dry goods stores, who was capable of an imagination so dark it eclipsed the devil himself. After the incident at the Verde River, the ghost retreated into the thicket of the landscape. For years, the sightings became sporadic, assuming the quality of a mirage, vast stretches of time where the desert was just the desert. Then a report would surface. A cowboy near the San Francisco River would report a humped beast drinking at a remote tank. A freight driver on the road to Fort Thomas would claim his mules were spooked by a scent that wasn't horse, bear, or lion. A musk that smelled of foreign dust and ancient decay. The ghost was aging. The red ghost of 1883 had been a powerhouse, capable of crushing women and toppling tents. The red ghost of the late 1880s and early 1890s was a survivor. It was likely starving. The desert is not kind to herbivores. A camel can eat creosote and cactus. But the caloric energy required to carry a dead weight, even a skeletal one, would be immense. The beast was essentially running a marathon that lasted a decade. We must imagine the sensory reality of the animal. The rawhide straps, originally supple, would have dried and tightened in the sun. They would have cut through the hair. Then the dermis. Then the muscle. The body of the rider would have slowly disintegrated, shaken apart by the loping gait, picked at by buzzards during the rare moments the beast slept. By 1892, the ghost was no longer a monster. It was a tragedy on four legs. It was a walking infection. A creature existing in a state of constant, low-grade agony. The red, in its name, once referring to its hair, now likely referred to the open sores and the raw flesh exposed by the shifting burden on its back. February 15th, 1893. The ending of the legend did not happen on a storm-swept peak or in a box canyon shootout. It happened in a turnip patch. Mizu Hastings was a rancher who woke early. He lived near the banks of the San Francisco River. A man concerned with the mundane realities of agriculture. The morning was cold, the frost clinging to the shadows of the mesquite. The sky was that particular brittle blue that promises a hard freeze. Hastings walked out to check his garden. He heard the sound of eating. It was a wet, crunching sound. He moved around the corner of his shed, expecting a stray steer or perhaps a deer. What he saw froze him. Not with the supernatural terror of the Eagle Creek women, but with the shock of recognition. The beast was there. It was gaunt, its ribs showing through the patchy, matted fur like the hoops of a barrel. It was on its knees, eating the tops off the turnips. It looked exhausted. The devil rider was gone, shaken loose by time and gravity, leaving only the saddle of its torture. Hastings didn't think about folklore. He didn't think about the ghost stories. He saw a massive, invasive animal destroying his winter crop. He raised his Winchester. He was a practical man. He didn't shout a challenge. He didn't ask it what it was. He centered the iron sights on the animal's shoulder, exhaled a breath of white steam into the cold air, and squeezed the trigger. The report of the rifle shattered the morning silence. The heavy .44-40 slug struck the beast with the force of a sledgehammer. The red ghost didn't scream. It didn't charge. It simply collapsed. The legs buckled, and the massive bulk hit the frozen earth with a sound that felt final. It kicked once, a reflex of dying nerves, and then lay still. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. Hastings approached the carcass, livering another round into the chamber just in case. As he got closer, the smell hit him. A potent mix of musk, infection, and old death. It was a camel, undeniable and massive. But as he looked at the back of the creature, the true horror of the last 10 years revealed itself. The Mojave County miner would later detail the findings, but it is in the forensic reconstruction that we find the emotional core of the story. Hastings called his neighbors. They examined the body with the curiosity of men who had lived in fear of a shadow for a decade. The animal's back was a landscape of torture. Across the hump and the rib cage was a network of heavy rawhide strands. They were not sitting on top of the skin. They were in it. The leather had been tied wet, and as it dried over the years, it had shrunk. It had sliced through the hide and the muscle, becoming embedded in the living tissue of the camel. The camel had grown around its bindings. There was no body attached anymore, just the straps. The rider had fallen away, piece by piece, bone by bone, mile by mile, leaving the animal to carry the memory of the weight. The men stood around the carcass, hats in hands. The feeling wasn't triumph. It wasn't the jubilation of killing a monster. It was a somber, heavy realization. They hadn't been hunted by a demon. They had been haunted by a victim. But the echo remains. To this day, the identity of the rider is unknown. This story is called The Red Ghost. Written and read by the author. Me, James Cawley. Please forgive the minimal closing this week. I'm on vacation with my family and wanted to make sure I got this story out, while not missing out on living my own. I'll be back next week with another. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes.